for Islamic Terrorism. Syndicated columnist and TV commentator Bob Novak is among the panelists who took part in a discussion Saturday hosted by the group American Cause. It's about 90 minutes.
Okay. Welcome back to the final panel of the American Cause Conference on America's Security in the Age of Terrorism. Our topic this afternoon is democracy the antidote for Islamic terrorism? I'll briefly introduce each of our speakers in the order that they'll speak. They'll then give a 10 to 12 minute opening statement, after which you can ask them your questions by writing them down and sending them up. The first speaker will be Clifford May, who is a former New York Times foreign correspondent and president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a policy institute focusing on terrorism. He writes a nationally syndicated column for Scripps Howard News Service and is a regular contributor to National Review Online, CNN's American Morning, and National Public Radio's Morning Edition. Bob Novak is a nationally syndicated columnist, one of America's great political reporters. He is a co-host of CNN's Crossfire and Capital Gain. He began his reporting career at the Joliet Herald News, worked for the Champaign-Urbana Courier, eventually the Wall Street Journal. Third speaker will be Michael Ledeen, an expert on U.S. foreign policy, particularly state sponsors of terrorism, Iran, the Middle East. He is a former consultant to the NSC and to the U.S. State and Defense Departments. His latest book is entitled The War Against Terror Masters. And the final panelist is Pat Buchanan, the chairman of the American Cause, who has been an advisor to Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, is a regular contributor to MSNBC, and is the author of several books, including the best-selling A Republic, Not an Empire. Cliff?
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be in such illustrious company, and I'm very pleased to get a chance to address all of you, and you all deserve to be commended for spending your weekend worrying about these issues, and I hope I can make some good points. The question we're to address today, as it was put in the brochure, is whether democracy is the antidote to Islamic terrorism, or Islamist terrorism, as I think is better to say. I can give you my answer in 2 sentences. And that is, no, it's not the antidote, but yes, it needs to be part of the treatment. Now, I was hoping that when I said that, Pat and Bob would have a V8 moment, you know. They would just slap their fist in their head and say, oh, I see what you mean, and then I wouldn't have to go on. But because they haven't done that, and maybe some of you don't yet agree with me, I will attempt to elaborate. You cannot fight terrorism without fighting terrorists. You have to eliminate both those who load cars with explosives and those who tell them where to go and whom to kill. Now, I think most people grasp this concept. Well, Michael Moore doesn't, and Howard Dean doesn't, and John Kerry doesn't, but I think most people grasp the concept that you have to fight terrorists if you're to fight terrorism. But neither can you fight terrorism without fighting the ideas that inspire young men, and in some cases young women, to choose to end their lives in spectacular acts of mass murder. This concept baffles some people. Start on the left with people like Michael Kinsley. If you read his column last Sunday, Michael Kinsley, you all know, he's the editorial page editor these days of the LA Times, but he's been around for a long time. Kinsley is outraged that President Bush, after 9/11, changed his mind about the advisability of promoting freedom and democracy and human rights in corners of the world that have only known tyranny. If Bush supports democratic reforms, then Kinsley and his friends on the left are absolutely opposed to it. And I suppose if Kinsley had been around in the 19th century, he would have opposed the Emancipation Proclamation too. Because first of all, it's a Republican proposing it, Lincoln, and second of all, Lincoln sold the Civil War as a way to keep the Union together. It took him 2 years before he came up with this strange and utopian notion about freeing the slaves. Now, peculiarly, I think, Kinsley and his friends on the left have taken a position very close to our friends Pat Buchanan and Bob Novak on the right. For Pat, it is naive to suppose that liberty can blossom in the Arab, Muslim landscape. Besides, Pat says, Americans have brought terrorism on themselves through interventionist policies. Well, on Meet the Press recently, Pat said, what happened on 9/11 was the result of interventionism. Interventionism is the cause of terror. But if that were true, then Latin Americans would be terrorizing us because we have intervened in Central America more often than we have in Muslim countries. We also should have Haitian terrorists because we've interfered extensively there. We've interfered also extensively in the former republics of the Soviet, the Russian Empire, really, but we don't have Russian terrorists. The atrocities of 9/11 were orchestrated by Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian. How before 9/11 did we intervene in Egyptian affairs, except, of course, to give Egypt billions of dollars, to resupply its military, and turn a blind eye to Hosni Mubarak's repression of dissidents? In fact, $57 billion in aggregate aid went to Egypt, and it only served to create one of the most anti-American cultures in the world, a culture that is furious that right now we're giving a few $1,000,000 to some Arab reformers in Egypt and other countries. Now, Atta was following the orders of Osama bin Laden, a Saudi. For more than 50 years, American interventionism in Saudi Arabia has consisted of paying the kingdom astronomical sums of money for oil, granting Saudis unprecedented privileges in the United States, for example, the right to vet Muslim clerics in our military and in our prisons. And in 1990, sending American soldiers at the specific request of the Saudis to protect them from being invaded by Saddam Hussein. But there have been other interventions. For example, we intervened in Somalia in 1993. The goal of that intervention was only and simply to feed starving Somalis. We intervened in Afghanistan, and that was to support guerrillas fighting the Soviet invader. We intervened in Bosnia and Kosovo. Why? To save Muslim communities from further devastation at the hands of their neighbors. So clearly it can't be interventionism that has spawned anti-American terrorism. What is it then? If you listen to our enemies, they're telling you. They tell us over and over again. Start with Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb was an Egyptian, an intellectual. He was the godfather of most of today's radical Islamists. He rejected not interventionism, but American-style democracy. As a student in the United States in the late 1940s, he saw the freedoms we cherish, and he was disgusted by them. Democracy as a form of government is already bankrupt in the West, he wrote. Why should it be imported to the Middle East? Bin Laden similarly reviles the United States as a nation that refuses to submit to the law of Allah. You Americans, he has said, choose to implement your own inferior rules and regulations, thus following your own vain whims and desires. Note that in his 1998 fatwa, Osama bin Laden called on Muslims to kill Americans on sight, and he cited two principal grievances. One, U.S. infidel troops defiling holy Saudi soil, and two, the U.S. sanctions on Iraq. Now, of course, our troops today are gone from Saudi Arabia, and Iraq is the recipient of billions of dollars in U.S. aid. So has Osama bin Laden called it quits and gone back to Saudi Arabia to become a developer again? No. No, he's come up with new grievances, and surely that has to tell you something. Abu Musab Zarqawi, who is the leader of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq right now, we're fighting him, also has told us very specifically why he fights. Democratic institutions, he says, are un-Islamic. Quote, we have declared a bitter war against the principle of democracy and all those who seek to enact it. He said this in the audio tape released just before the January 30th vote. Candidates, he said, in elections are seeking to become demigods, and those who vote for them are infidels. The point is not just that radical Islamists despise us for reasons that no shift in foreign policy, no attempt at compromise or appeasement could address. The point also is that our enemies recognize that our fundamental values are a threat to their fundamental values. Our ideas are, as Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the Iranian revolutionary, said, seductive. That's what he meant when he called us the great Satan. We seduce people with our ideas. Those who embrace liberty will not support Islamist supremacism and totalitarianism. And what is the alternative to promoting our values? Too many of us, Victor Davis Hanson, the military historian, has argued, have forgotten that this messy business of encouraging freedom and democracy was the successor, not the precursor, to a litany of other failed prescriptions for treating the diseases that afflict Arab and Muslim nations. September 11th, Hanson adds, was the wage of decades of American appeasement and neglect, a pathological Middle East left alone to blame others for its self-induced mess. Now, since September 11th, President Bush has been trying something new, testing whether such ideas as self-rule and tolerance may be more inspiring than the poisonous brew of Islamism and terrorism and fascism that bin Laden and his ilk offer. But to Pat and Bob and Mike Kinsley, this is all neoconservative and they want none of it. Hanson, I think, has a better name, a more accurate name. He says this is a policy of muscular idealism. Muscular idealism does not imply imposing freedom and democracy on anybody. Instead, it proposes at long last extending support to those fighting, suffering, and dying for ideals we share, even if they happen to be Arabs or Muslims. They, and not their oppressors, are our allies. And I should add, I've worked for 3 years now with such Muslim and Arab freedom fighters. So I know they exist, and they deserve not just our admiration, but also our support. But let me sum up with this. Military people understand that it takes force to defeat a violent and determined enemy. People of ideas, like you and I, need to understand that it takes good ideas to beat bad ideas. Yet in a way, what Michael Kinsley and Pat and Bob are arguing is that in the war of ideas, we should unilaterally disarm. I think that's an odd position, and I think this is an odd alliance. I'll leave you with one more thought, a quote from President Reagan. "The future belongs to the free." I propose that we take the Reaganite road as we defend ourselves against those who are fighting a war, against the free world, and against those who want to keep it that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. The funny thing is that Cliff May and I very often over the last year have been on the same side in the debates on Crossfire, on the same side in talking about the war in Iraq. How can that be? Well, because although he puts me in the same category as Michael Kinsley, the leftist, when American boots land in any area, I am always for the American fighting man. I didn't say men and women, the fighting man, wherever they may be in the world. And the people who were trying to win the last election by attacking our troops and our effort, Cliff May and I found ourselves on the same side of the street. The question, I believe, whether or not democracy is the antidote to terrorism, is really the wrong question. The right question is it feasible? Is it practical? Is it desirable for the United States to have a neo-Wilsonian policy of spreading democracy around the world? Can you even begin to fulfill that kind of policy? For example, what do we do about Russia? Is Russia really a democracy? Is anybody that naive? Do we then come ahead with sanctions against the ex-KGB agent, Mr. Putin, who's in charge, when we have arrangements with Mr. Putin? Mr. Putin has a lot of nuclear weapons. I don't believe anybody believes that the Soviet Union is feeding terrorism around the world. Is there any point in the United States trying to turn Kazakhstan into Iowa. I don't think that's feasible or a possible scenario. What about China? 1.25 billion people. Not very democratic, Cliff, at all. What are we supposed to do about China? Do you think are they a problem in terrorism right now? They may be a rival of ours in the Pacific, but nobody is suggesting that we go ahead with military operations against China. On the question of our invasion of Iraq, is there anybody who really believes now that, one, Iraq at that moment posed a serious military threat to the United States? The United States government has admitted there were no weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence agencies made a mistake. I believe it was an honest mistake, although for some reason I, as a humble newspaperman, knew there were no weapons of mass destruction, and the CIA did not. Secondly, is there anybody who seriously believes that there was a link between Iraq and the 9/11 disaster? Only in Bill Sapphire's column did we discover that there was a secret meeting in Prague, but nobody else believed it. Nobody thought it was serious. The fact of the matter is that the day after 2 days after 9/11, I talked to my old friend Richard Pearl. We all know Richard Pearl, and he was a good, hard-line anti-communist, as Mr. Buchanan and I were. I think we were in the same battleground for a long time. And I said, isn't it true that Osama bin Laden is using Afghanistan for his headquarters? That what we have to do is take a military action against Afghanistan. And he said, no, he said there aren't very many good targets in Afghanistan. It's not a good military area. He was a former Secretary of Defense. I'm just a humble newspaper man. I thought there were some pretty good targets in Afghanistan. He said, where we have to go is Iraq. I said, Iraq? What is the connection between Iraq and 9/11? He said, wait till you find out what it was. Well, I am still waiting to see that connection long after those events. The question that you have to ask, and the Democrats ask this all the time, and they're not always wrong, is Iraq today a greater source of terrorism and danger to the United States from terrorists than it was under Saddam Hussein? And the answer probably is yes. Am I glad that Saddam Hussein is out of there? Absolutely. Are the Iraqi people in the long run better off that he's out of there? Absolutely. But what it has to do with fighting terrorism still escapes me. I believe, too, that there are limits to how much the United States can go around the world as the preserver and the promoter of democracy. I have heard a lot of speeches in my half-century as a reporter in this town, and I doubt I have heard one that disturbed me as much as President Bush's second inaugural address. I thought that the ghost of Woodrow Wilson had somehow infested itself in his body and was speaking out with passing democracy all over the world. I am for democracy, but how in the world can we take on this task? Just in the two places that we're worried about a nuclear danger against the United States, in Iran and in North Korea, we don't have the military means, and we don't have in any way a strategy for a military attack. We are stretched to the limit to keep this operation in Iraq going without a draft. And there's not going to be a draft. There's no popular will to support a conscription in this country. Even if we did have the military means, a war, Iran is a much larger country than Iraq. They have done war games at the Pentagon for years, and it's an unfeasible operation. Saddam Hussein has thought that a war against Iran in 1979 would be an easy matter. It was a horrendous fight that killed millions of people and led to all the anguish for Iraq today. What about North Korea? Are we ready for another Korean War? Another destruction of the city of Seoul? And beyond those places for promoting democracy in two very undemocratic areas, whatever it has to do with terrorism, what do we do about Africa if we are really promoting democracy over the world? One of the rarest things in the world is a democratic African country. They just don't believe in that kind of thing. And even rarer is a non-corrupt African country, but that's another story. We don't want to get into that, do we? The question is, how in the world can the United States set itself off on this Wilsonian dream of spreading democracy around the world? Let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. I do a lot of reporting, and there's one thing that the policymakers in this country are dying to do. Cliff may not be dying to do it, but they want to get out of Iraq. That is the greatest desire, and the idea that the democratic government that has been elected there, that is a tripartite system with the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis, that this is going to be a feasible, viable government, that they're all going to get along, that it's going to be like the Iowa legislature, that is just something that nobody believes. What they hope is that they can get their security forces in shape so that I'll call them terrorists, the insurgents, don't kill soldiers and government officials any times that they please to. But all we want to do now is get out of there. It is not a matter of any serious person saying, boy, we are going to plant the seeds of democracy that are going to live forever. Finally, the idea that many of these people, I got the same thing from Cliff again, they always take a whack at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the least democratic country in the world. I would say that. I don't think there's any, I think Iran's more democratic than Saudi Arabia. And of course, Egypt is pretty undemocratic too. But is it in the interest of the United States to try to redo these governments, to try to turn them, to Iowanize these governments as well? I don't believe that is a course that anybody wants to go down. This government gets a lot of abuse on not doing well and fighting the war on terrorism. There has not been a terrorist attack since 9/11. I hope there won't be. That doesn't mean we're going to be safe. But I believe that a lot of efforts have been done. I think the intelligence services are better. But what in the world does democratizing these undemocratic countries have to do with trying to prevent terrorism? What is the source of the terrorism? The source of the terrorism is that we are allies of Israel. Should we therefore not be allies of Israel? Not in my opinion. I think we're bound to Israel. But as long as we're bound to them, these people who feel that they are a Western cancer in the Arab world are going to associate us with it. And the idea that they just don't like the democratic system, which President Bush says all the time and Cliff May says all the time, simply is not accurate. I would say that those are harsh words coming from me, and I'm sorry to say them, but I do believe that we have great things to do in this country. We have problems. I think this president is on to a lot of very good solutions. And just know, so you know where I am coming from, I am not a protectionist. I believe in globalism. I believe in the multi-cultural, multinational world, but I don't believe in the United States being the policeman of the world, instilling democracy where it would be nice for it to come, but probably won't ever come. Thank you.
Pat and Bob are now going to arm wrestle over protectionism and globalism and so forth. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm an historian, so my training is not the same as Bob's or Pat's, which is to look at individual events and try to be smart about them. I try to look at longer periods of time. We have been under attack from terrorists now for about 25 years. Right? If you want to try to date the beginning of the terrorist assault against the United States, I mean, you can pick there's various dates. There's 1979, which is the Iranian Revolution. There's 1983, which is the huge terrorist attack against American and French military and diplomatic installations in Beirut. But in any case, it's been running along virtually nonstop for quite a long time. This attack was not an attack against one policy or another, because our policies have changed all through those years. Nor was it limited to one part of the world, because all through the 70s and 80s, terrorists attacked Americans all over Western Europe, which was certainly not a part of the debate over the greater or lesser Middle East or over policy towards Saudi Arabia, Israel, or anything else. It was just attacks against the United States. And through most of those years, most of the support for dangerous terrorist organizations, most of it, not all of it, came from the Soviet Union. And that was one of the reasons why we were so busily trying to bring down the Soviet Empire. And I will remind you all that when Ronald Reagan took office and we went in 1981 to try to bring an end to the Soviet Empire, all the smart people said, what a ridiculous idea. Bring down the Soviet Empire. All this wonderful intelligence community that Bob seems to like, for reasons I cannot understand, because in my experience, they've been wrong on virtually every major question of our time. Always, always wrong. An almost unbelievably great track record. On the eve of the fall of the Soviet Empire, CIA was telling us that Gorbachev was firmly in control, that the Soviet economy was expanding, that the Soviet system was going to last forever, and so forth. And crazy idealists like Ronald Reagan and Richard Perle and some of the rest of us insisted that the Soviet Union could and should be brought down peacefully, without armed conflict, without invasion, without dropping bombs on any place, but just by political support of people who wanted to be free. And through all those years, I was constantly lectured by people who said, what are you talking about? People want to be free. Georgians, Ukrainians, Russians, what do they know about free? They've never been free. They've never had a free government. They've never had a free election. The religion they have has never undergone a reformation. Many of the same things that people say right now about Muslims were said then about Russians and about subjects of the Soviet Empire. And yet, as Galileo said, it moves. And it's really quite astonishing to me that people, after all we've been through for all these years, that people still believe that there are groups of people in this world who really don't want to be free, or somehow they're not up to freedom. That there's just something in their DNA, there's a missing democracy chromosome that makes them unfit for democracy, for self-government and all of that. And yet that's what you hear all the time. It used to be about Central and East Europeans and Russians. Today, it's about Africans and Arabs. But I promise you that if the people of Iran today could hold a free election, no one with a turban would be elected to anything. And you would have the most secular, most pro-Western, most pro-American government in the entire Middle East. Why? Because, I mean, they've suffered under what Osama bin Laden wants. They've had a Shiite caliphate for the last 25 years, and they hate it. Because they are the ones who are being slaughtered and tortured and arrested and silenced by this monstrous regime, which is, coincidentally, the world's greatest sponsor of terrorism. Yes, there's limitations to Wilsonianism. But the fact of the matter is that we didn't pick this war. They started it. They attacked us. And the question is, how do we respond to it? What are the weapons we have available? And as Bob rightly says, we don't have an army capable of liberating every country in the world. But President Bush has noticed a very interesting thing. That is, he said right after September 11th, we have been attacked by a combination of terror networks and countries that support them. And we are not going to distinguish between terrorist organizations and regimes that support terrorist organizations because they're one and the same thing. It's the same evil collection. I wrote a book called The War Against the Terror Masters. I pointed out that if you look at the countries that support terrorism in the Middle East today, the Soviet Union having gone, and by the way, if you track the terrorism curve, you'll find that when the Soviet Empire fell, there was a drop in terrorism, and then it revived as the countries I call the terror masters started to support it again. They were four, basically: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. Those are the countries which, in different ways and through different channels, some mainly by finance, some mainly by military training, others by providing intelligence assistance and so forth. These were the big sponsors of terrorism. Now, if you look at those four countries and ask yourself, what do they have in common? It is not radical Islam. Because, yes, two of those countries are Islamic nutcases: Saudi Arabia and Iran. They are extremist, fanatic, religious regimes, theocratic regimes. But Iraq and Syria, the Ba'athist regimes, had no religious standing at all. They were secular Arab socialists. And it wasn't until very late in the day, when Islamism seemed to be catching on, that Saddam, for example, put out the story that he'd given 60 pints of his own blood to have a Quran written in it so it could be presented in a museum on the outskirts of Baghdad. These are the people we're at war with. Their common denominator is tyranny. It is no accident that they attacked us. When I was in graduate school, we were forced to read a 2-volume essay by a professor from Princeton named R.R. Palmer called The Age of the Democratic Revolution. The thesis of those 2 volumes, still a masterpiece, still should be read, was that if you look at the last quarter of the 18th century, time of the American Revolution, French Revolution, and so forth, and you look at all of the world, all of the civilized world at that time, you find that there wasn't a single country that did not have some impulse and some attempt at democratic revolution. It was a global phenomenon. The most successful of those revolutions was ours, the American Revolution. Ours has proven to be the most durable, the most successful, the most flexible of all the revolutions that came out of that period. If you look at the last 25 to 30 years, I think what you see globally is that this is happening again. It's no accident that these democratic revolutions, which brought down the Soviet Empire, which transformed South America, which spread across Asia, and yes, even into some corners of Africa, are more or less mostly inspired by American success, American values, American models. Not that they necessarily love us. A lot of them hate us because they think we're not up to it, that we haven't lived up to our own ideals, that we can do much better. They think they can do better. God bless them. But the point is that this is not, what is happening in the world today is not the result, just the result of American policy. What's going on in the world today is part of a global phenomenon which has been going on for quite a long time, and I think President Bush deserves full credit for having recognized it. I'll just close with this thought. We have only 2 choices in the war against terrorism, the same 2 we have always had. We can either win or lose. There's no way out. They're going to keep attacking us. They've been at it for a long time. Our most potent weapon against these people is not American armed forces. I was opposed to the war in Iraq when it happened and how it happened, as you may recall. I thought it was a mistake. I thought that we should do Iran first. I think that we can liberate Iran without firing a single bullet. I think we should be supporting democratic forces in that country. I think the country is entirely ready for it. The people are begging for that kind of assistance from us. That is what we did for Poland, for East Germany, for Soviet distance and so forth. If we could bring down the Soviet Union in 10 years with the modest effort that we directed against us, how can anybody believe that we cannot bring down these hostile crazy terrorist tyrannies in a couple of years with all the resources at our disposal. And the last point is that in the Soviet Union, we had a very small percentage of the population that was willing to fight for freedom. Maybe 5%, 10%, whatever it amounted to. According to the government's own polls in Iran, more than 70% of Iranians hate the regime and are willing to take action against it. And you see it every day. There's not a day that goes by without demonstrations against that regime somewhere in Iran. That's the kind of policy that I would be proud to have my government have, and I'm really very disturbed that we're not doing anything. I mean, great speeches all the time, but no action. Why is that? It's always worked. We're very good at that. America's a very subversive country. American values are death to tyrants, which is why they hate us and which is why we're at war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me say first, with regard to the whether or not Mr. Novak and I were in battle against the Soviet Empire in the Soviet Union, I think I know Robert Novak I've known for a long, long time, even when he was on the other side. And he and Rollie Evans were, they might have been sort of Rockefeller Republicans. They were strong supporters of the American effort in Vietnam, and they were strong supporters of every tough step taken by the United States in the Cold War. And Mr. Novak wrote a book on the Reagan Revolution, which was all about foreign policy. And I will say for myself, I was the author of most of the Captive Nations resolutions written by Richard Nixon back in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s. Let me talk to this point about Iran. I agree with Michael that in Iran, there's no doubt about it, that 70% of the people there have voted twice against the mullahs. I think in a free vote, they would vote to get rid of the mullahs. And I think that would be a good thing. There's no doubt about it. What I don't agree is that the United States, any kind of military invasion, would be wise. Let me go back to a little history myself. The great John Quincy Adams said that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the champion of liberty everywhere. She is the vindicator only of her own. That is in the tradition of Washington and John Adams and Jefferson and the great presidents. In around 1850, Kossuth came over to this country. Hungarian patriot, wanted our support to overthrow the Austro-Hungarian Empire and break free. And Henry Clay said, we're holding a lamp of liberty on this shore. In other words, he was saying what Lord Byron says, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. That's been the American tradition. We broke with that in 1917 when Woodrow Wilson, who could not figure out what they were fighting about in 1916, said we're going abroad to make the world safe for democracy. As a result of that war, 116,000 Americans died. The British Empire added 900,000 square miles to its territory, and we didn't get democracy. We got Lenin and Stalin and Mussolini and Hitler. And so a lot of Americans are skeptical of crusades for democracy where they want American lives put on the line for someone else's democracy, because too often it does not work. But let me get to the issue we're supposed to be talking about. Is democracy the antidote to Islamic terror? In my judgment, democracy, a good thing, democratic republic we have is the greatest on earth, but democracy is irrelevant to terrorism. What is terrorism? It is a tactic. It is a weapon that people use from time immemorial. It is the deliberate killing of innocents for political ends. The Romans did it in Carthage. It's been done down through history. I've broken it down into 4 kinds of terrorism. There's anarchic terrorism, which appears to be done for no purpose whatsoever other than to unsettle the political condition. The murder of President McKinley by an anarchist in Buffalo in 1901 seemed to have no specific political purpose. There is state terrorism. We saw that under Hitler and Stalin. purpose of terrorism is to terrify, said Lenin brilliantly. But that was the purpose there. As Stalin said, shoot one and encourage 1,000. There is war terror, in which we ourselves have engaged. What General Sherman did in Georgia was war terror. What General Grant told Sheridan to do, he said, I don't want to see a crow flying over the Shenandoah. Make sure it'll have to carry its own rations. In other words, burn them all out. That's state terror. What General LeMay did in Nagasaki, one bomb, 40,000 dead, to break the will of the emperor and tell him to surrender. Killing of innocents for political ends. Then there's what we're talking about today, and that is revolutionary terror. The purpose of that is invariably to overthrow or destabilize a hated regime. Now, in my judgment, democracy is no defense necessarily against terrorism. Democracies have been targeted. The IRA have been targeting the British, who are one of the most democratic people on earth, in order to get the British out of Northern Ireland to unite the North with the South. The French were targeted by the Algerian FLN. There are Basque terrorists in democratic Spain, still blowing off bombs. Baader-Meinhof gang, Germany. Red Army in Italy. In the United States, they go back even before 1971, where I think Michael Ledeen pointed out, I was a kid in a hospital, Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where I spent 3 months in traction and a body cast, when a terrorist tried to kill Harry Truman. They're Puerto Rican terrorists, and they're the Revolutionary Puerto Rican Group, and they tried to kill him at Blair House. I think it was in November of 1950. Then 4 years later, they tried to shoot up the House of Representatives and did, wounded 5 congressmen. Who were they? They're Puerto Rican terrorists who wanted Puerto Rico independent of the United States. We handled that very well by simply saying, Puerto Rico wants to leave, we'll give them a free vote, they can leave the United States. And we treated it and we dealt with the terrorists themselves. We didn't use mass military action, and we succeeded. Now let's go to the Middle East. Is democracy the cure for terrorism there? In my judgment, democracy is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition of ending terrorism. I say that for this reason. The Arab world, there's 22 Arab states, they have never been democratic. And yet we have never been attacked before this present era by the Arab states since the Barbary pirates. And Jefferson did not go ashore on the north coast of Africa to democratize it. He sent some naval officers to take care of the problem. Why are they attacking us now, these terrorists? They are over here because we are over there. They are coming over to the United States because we are in their backyard. We are interfering in their internal affairs. We're telling them how to arrange their internal affairs. We dominate their politics. We support Israel. As someone mentioned, there wasn't one, there was two. There were 3 causes in the fatwa of Osama bin Laden published in 1998. One was, as mentioned, the infidels are on the sacred soil of Saudi Arabia. Second was we were persecuting the Iraqis and we were going to attack them again, which proved true. And third, we're supporting the Israelis against the Palestinians. Now, I think if we want to know why Osama bin Laden's attacking us, we're probably better off looking at what he says rather than what some of our panelists say is his motivation. Now, how do you end terror? One way empires end terror is giving up the empire. When the French left Algeria, de Gaulle got them out in 1962, FLN terror, blowing up movie theaters and bars, restaurants, all manner of horror, FLN terror against the French ended. They had gone home. When the Israelis got out of Lebanon, by and large, not entirely, by and large, Hezbollah acts of terror against Israel ended. When the British got out of Palestine, Menachem Begin stopped blowing up their hotels. The Zionist terrorism ended. When we took the Marines out of Beirut, which Ronald Reagan wisely did, that's the one act in the whole Cold War that I opposed, was putting Marines in Beirut, because I'd been in Israel a couple of months before, and we were supposed to be driven up to Beirut, and the Israelis said, we don't think that's a good idea. And I said, if they don't think it's a good idea for me going up there, why should we stick Marines in there in the middle of a civil war? Is none of our business. It had nothing to do with our war, which was the Cold War. But when Reagan took them out, the terrorism against Americans ended. When the Russians got out of Afghanistan, terrorism against the Russians there ended. The same will be true of Chechnya. And when the U.S. gets out of Iraq, Iraqis will stop attacking Americans in Iraq. What is the main source of terrorism right now? We've heard Syria mentioned. Now, I don't have much brief for the fellow that runs Syria, Mr. Hafez al-Assad's son, but I mean, his father, the Israelis offered him 99% of the Golan Heights. The son is clearly not as bad a fellow. He didn't commit the atrocity in Hama that his father did, but what is the greater source of danger and terror attacks on the United States? Syria or the Sunni Triangle? We have created a new haven for terrorism to replace the one we did away with in Afghanistan. Is that wise public policy? As long as we're there, the attacks are going to continue. Now, is democracy in the Middle East a good thing? Sure, I'd like to see democracy in the Middle East. But before you pray too hard for that, you better know what you're going to get. Now, in Iran, Michael and I happen to agree on that. I think any overthrow there in Iran is going to be to our benefit. And I think because they've gone through the experience of Islamism, 20 years is all you need. They're ready to throw them out the way the Russian people were ready to throw the communists out. But the Arab world is a different story. If you get there in the Arab world, you get a free press. It's not going to be the Washington Post or Washington Times. It's going to be Al Jazeera. You get freedom of religion. You're going to get Sharia, as they're getting in southern Iraq right now, in Basra. One man, one vote. You get Hamas in Gaza. You will get Mr. Barghouti, currently in an Israeli prison, on the West Bank. And in Egypt, you won't get Hosni Mubarak. You will get the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, if you're going to say we're all for democracy, one man, one vote, whatever they say, are we really all for that? And if for example, the king of Morocco and the king of Jordan and the king of Saudi Arabia were overthrown, something only I believe Michael Ledeen here would like to see very soon, I don't think the results would be very positive. And if I were in Saudi Arabia, please give me a week to get to the airport before they become democratic. So in Afghanistan, we've got a measure of freedom there, and we heard Arnaud say it's a narco-democracy. That's regrettable, and it's too bad, and I'm sorry it happened. So what is my conclusion? Is look, terrorism is a tactic our enemies are using to kill us, and they have an agenda. And their agenda is to drive the Americans out of their part of the world because they think they're going to take control, and they're going to create a caliphate, and they're going to be able to challenge the United States of America, and they are all full of it. They will take power if they did in Sudan, they did in Iran, they did in Afghanistan, and they will fail, like the communists failed. And we can outlast them. If we conduct a defensive policy, go after the terrorists, targeted attacks on the terrorists, stay out of their region, I would say we need to do only three things: shut down the empire, defend America's borders, and bring the troops home. Thank you very much.
Please write your questions and send them up. Let me start with a question for you, Michael. Isn't it true that Sheikh Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, was involved in the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut? That was the worst attack against the United States. Yeah, he was. Yeah. And he's the head of Hezbollah today, right?
Well, the same people are the head of Hezbollah who were then, because the operational chief, Imad Mughniya, who is the person who actually carried out the suicide attempt in Beirut, he's in and out of Iraq all the time.
Now, isn't there at least a chance, though, that Hezbollah, led by this man who is behind the Marine barracks bombing, could become a dominant political force in a democratic Lebanon?
I don't think so, but I mean, we will see.
If it happened, what would the United States do?
If it happened, the United States would work against that regime as it should have been working against the Syrian and Iranian regimes all along. But the fact is that you're finessing the major issue, which is Iran. Hezbollah is an Iranian creation, and it is run on the basis of a joint venture between Iran and Syria. Iran controls the organization, Syria controls the territory. Pat is entirely wrong when he goes through that whole list of we stopped doing this and terrorism against us stopped. Terrorism didn't stop against us when we withdrew from Beirut. It stopped in Beirut because they didn't have targets anymore, but it continued elsewhere. That's why we eventually attacked Libya, because they attacked us in Western Europe. And they created sleeper cells all over the United States, not because we were over there, but because that's what they are, that they must attack us.
But wait a minute,
Well,
I know something about Libya because I was in the White House and I wrote the speech where we attacked them. What happened first was they said that bay over there is our national waters, so we sent some destroyers in. So they sent a couple of planes out to intimidate the fleet, and we shot them down. So then they blew up the thing in Berlin, and so then Reagan retaliated against them, and so then they retaliated against Pan Am 103. So these were a series of actions. They were deplorable and reprehensible, and if we should have done something against Libya, we should have done it at the end of the Reagan, beginning of the Bush administration. But look, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Bush negotiated with Libya. He negotiated with a terrorist. He got him to give up his weapons of mass destruction. It seems to me I credit him with a victory there. It can be done without invading every country in that region.
Yeah, that's my central thesis. It's exactly what I've been saying. So don't yell at me as if I was advocating,
I wasn't
invasion.
yelling. I was just raising the decibel.
No, but no, what I'm saying is that it's just fatuous to argue that every retreat is a new kind of victory and it will stop people from attacking us. It won't. It encourages them. Every time you back off from this kind of conflict, they come at you harder. You know that. I mean, you're Irish, for heaven's sake.
But, you know, look, when did we had an earlier panel. I'm sorry you weren't here. But between 1991, after we threw Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and 2003, we threw 40,000 sorties over his country. They didn't shoot down one. We cannot confirm a single incident of one terrorist attack on the United States of America, the killing of one citizen. Why in heaven's name would you send 150,000 people up to Baghdad saying he was a threat when nobody even in the region thought the guy was a threat?
Well, that's not true. In fact, the government of Egypt and the government of Jordan, in fact, every government in the region thought he was a threat. And if we were going to...
Nobody wanted him attacked.
Well, give me one full sentence, then you can have your three. But every government in the region said that he had chemical and biological weapons, and that if we attacked him, he was going to use them. So along with our intelligence failure, if you want to call it that, you have to give all the governments of the region. No, the great mistake about Iraq, the colossal mistake, is what I call Desert Shame, which was the first Gulf War. I mean, there we were, there it was. And you can quibble about should we have defended Saudi Arabia or not. But once we were there and the regime was ready to fall, it was just criminal for President Bush, first President Bush, to call on the Shiites and the Kurds to rise up and then abandon them and re-empower Saddam. I mean, we could have taken a big step forward right then and there.
If you want to get
I just wanted to say one thing in reference to your question, Terry, and that is that Sheikh Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah, which is supported, as you know, by Iran and by Syria, they have a TV station. It's really the first time in history that terrorists have their own TV station. It's called Al-Manar. And if you watch Al-Manar and what they say, they go through a litany of things for which they say, and this is their words, America owes the world blood. And it's everything from taking this country away from the Indians as they see it. It's the things that they believe we've done in Latin America. This station, which I would like to see entirely shut down, calls for jihad, for a holy war against the United States. It calls for suicide bombers or people to volunteer to become suicide bombers to attack the United States. And the litany of things they charge us with is endless. Now you can say, okay, look, these grievances, you got a good beef here, and so we'll do what you're asking us to do. But just watch the litany, and you'll know that we can't do everything that they want us to do. At the end of the day, what they are saying, and I agree with Pat, read Osama bin Laden, read Saeed Qutb, read any of these people, and you'll see what they're trying to do. They are trying to create a new empire that will rival the previous Islamic empires, the one created by Muhammad, and of course, the Ottoman Empire. And they believe that to do it, they must first build on the ashes of our civilization. It is the only way to reestablish the caliphate.
Yeah, Cliff, I actually have read some of Sheikh Nasrallah's speeches as translated by the BBC, and you're right, they're viciously, vehemently anti-American. Hezbollah's slogan is death to America, but the person in the audience asks, apropos to Pat's analysis, where has Hezbollah attacked Americans since we pulled out of Lebanon? Before that, they committed the worst attack. Where have they since then?
They haven't. There's no question. They've been focused their attention since then, as far as we know, on Israel and on, if they can, taking power in Lebanon. Although I'm not sure that they can. That doesn't. But there's a reason why they've been called the A-team of terrorists. They have established sleeper cells not just in this country, but very much throughout Latin America. Look, you could have said in summer of 2001. I don't see where al-Qaeda is a big threat to us. I mean, I know what Osama bin Laden's saying, and I know he's training terrorists in Afghanistan by the thousands, and essentially this is what the Clinton administration said, is what Sandy Berger said. But are they really a threat to us? Let's just cross our fingers and hope not. I'm not saying we should go into Lebanon and destroy Hezbollah. I am saying we should recognize that there is no little thing we can do that will make them say, oh, these aren't such bad guys, these Americans, never mind, we have no problem with them. They have a problem with us that we cannot solve through appeasement.
Bob, can the U.S. afford to be the global policeman while China and India focus on being the global businessman?
No, certainly not. We are stretched thin, and that's something that nobody ever wants to address. One thing we do, we're stretched so thin we ignore a lot of things that are troublesome. For example, we're in very bad shape in South America. The only thing you read about in South America is Colombia, where the Colombian army is getting the hell whacked out of it by guerrillas lately. But the Venezuelan oil state is gaining an influence. I wouldn't say, gentlemen, that Venezuela is a democratic state right now. Not at all.
Not at all.
Well, I'm really a lot more worried about democracy in Venezuela, where we have very great national interest, oil interest. It's in our back door than I am in countries that have never had any democracy, and there is no link to terrorism. So I really do believe that there are limits as to our military capabilities, and I would like to know by the people who want to invade Iran, who want to invade Syria, how are we going to while we're having a war against the insurgents in Iraq, while we're not nobody has the nerve to take the troops out of Korea. I would take them out right now, but they're worried that would entice the North Koreans. Where are our forces and troops going to come from? I'd like to hear the gentleman over there to answer that question.
Let me just answer it this way. We agree with you. We're not saying let's send troops right now to invade Iran. Let's send troops to invade Syria. Let's send troops to invade North Korea. I think the military option should never be so far off the table that our enemies aren't frightened of us. But you're absolutely right. What we're saying here, and this is the distinction, we're saying that it is vital that this country stand up and champion, as Pat says, champion our values, freedom, democracy, and human rights differentially. We recognize and we insist upon the fact that over the past 200 or so years, almost every revolution has been a failure. The Iranian Revolution is a failure, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. Our revolution was a success because our revolution was in pursuit of values that are universal and resonant. And we need to not be relativists and say, well, we're democratic, but the Saudis are not, but it's all okay, it's all the same. And no, let's say what the truth is. Their system, tyranny, totalitarianism, fascism, communism in any form is not as good as our system, and we know there are people in these countries who believe that as well, and let's support them. We knew during the Cold War, because of Reagan, because of Pat Buchanan, the names of the dissidents in the Soviet Union. How many of you know the names of the dissidents in the Arab world? Ayam Noor in Egypt, or Fathi al-Jami in Libya. These are the people we should support, not those who oppress them.
There's a difference. Now, let me tell you what the difference is, that the Soviet Union, in my opinion, I don't know if it was in yours, Cliff, but it was my opinion, I think it was in Pat's opinion, represented a threat to the security and, in fact, the existence of the United States.
Agreed.
I feel sorry for the dissidents in Egypt, but I don't believe Egypt is a threat to the to the existence of the United States. I don't think Saudi Arabia is. And I don't believe that we can be the nanny for the whole world and say that we are the protector of democracy in every corner.
Bob, is radical Islamism a threat to the United States, to the existence of the United States? If 1 billion Muslims are converted to bin Ladenism, is that a threat to us?
Look, let me say I agree with Bob 100%. Everything the Soviet Empire did, even before we were, quote, allies, was directed for bringing down the West and the United States of America. Everywhere they took power, they murdered people that agreed with us. They used subversion, they used terror, they used aggression, they used propaganda, all during the Cold War against us. They had a nuclear arsenal that was equal to ours. This was the great war of our time. Now, a bunch of guys in Afghanistan who are going to recreate the caliphate, over the entire Arab world, they're not going to do it. They're going to fail. Are they terrorist danger if you give them something and they can get over here? Right. That's why I say target the terrorists. We did Afghanistan for the right reason. Go in there and knock over that regime, go after those guys, and then come out and continue after them. What we are doing, arguing with Syria, for heaven's sakes, or meddling around in Lebanon, or invading Iraq, what is the relationship between that and the vital interest of the United States of America? If we got a problem on any border, it's not the Syrian-Iraqi border, it is the American-Mexican border.
Pat? Just this one sentence. The Soviets never did what bin Laden did, kill 3,000 Americans on American soil.
Go after bin Laden. I mean, I'm all for going after bin Laden. What has that got to do with Saddam Hussein? Bin Laden detested Saddam Hussein.
No, bin Laden supported Saddam Hussein. In fact, he said, yeah, even though he detested him, he said, okay, the Americans are coming, and we all know that Saddam Hussein's a dirty communist, but we have to support him anyway, and we're going to support him.
I think bin Laden, besides some of the neoconservatives, is the guy on earth happiest we're in Baghdad right now.
Abu Musab Zarqawi.
No. Look, I mean, that's just totally wrong. And you ask, why are we worried about the Iraq-Syrian border? And the answer is, look, I am the only person you know who accurately predicted what was going to happen in Iraq after we went in. And I predicted it months before we ever invaded Iraq. And it was because all the other terror masters in the region, the Saudis, the Syrians, and the Iranians, knew that if we succeeded in Iraq and created a stable, democratic polity in Iraq, that they were finished. It's an existential war for them. They must drive us out of Iraq. They must make us be seen to fail. It was one of the reasons why I thought we had the sequence wrong and why I thought we ought to go after Iran first, because that was, can I say it again because you keep forgetting it, Bob, political, not military. Didn't call for invasion, didn't call for bombs, didn't call for troops. Called for the kind of political support that we gave to the captive nations inside the Soviet Empire.
Would you say that Iraq today is a more dangerous base of anti-American terrorism than it was under Saddam?
No, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't say that?
No, I would say that what's going on in Iraq today is a desperate war against coalition forces and against the Iraqi people who desperately want to be free, sponsored by regimes who desperately want to make it fail because they are afraid of being swept away by their own people.
But Al-Qaeda clearly has a base in Iraq, where under Saddam it didn't have a base in Iraq.
The Al-Qaeda today in Iraq is represented by Zarqawi. He's their main guy. Zarqawi is a Jordanian Palestinian who created his organization while living in Tehran, an organization that extends from the Middle East all across Western Europe. If you take a look at the trial that's going on now in Spain, you will hear Zarqawi's name in connection with the bombing of the Madrid railroad station. It is just folly to believe that if we run away from the Middle East, that these people who are already all over our countries, I don't know how much you looked at this when we were in the White House in the 1980s, Pat, but we knew about Hezbollah sleeper cells in the United States in the 1980s. They've been here all along.
Let's go to the point again, though. We got Cliff May says not a single attack by Hezbollah against the United States people since we got out of Lebanon. 1991 to 2003, I can't think of a single attack We remember Khobar Towers, Cold, and all those other things. Not a single attack against Americans out of, or sponsored or organized and traceable to Saddam Hussein. Yet out of the Sunni Triangle, we got 1,600 dead Americans, 10,000 seriously wounded, 300 billion down the tubes, Zarqawi and thousands of Confederates there, and you've also given bin Laden and them this great cause, drive the American oppressors out of Iraq, this great recruiting cause. You got the president at 10% approval. How you can say that this hasn't advanced and metastasized this cancer, I don't know.
Well, I'm saying that they are desperate to fight this war, and I knew they were going to fight this war, and I said they were going to fight this war this way. I mean, they're not doing as well as they expected to do. I mean, we don't disagree on the wisdom of doing Iraq the way we did it, when and where we did it. I keep on saying. You keep acting as if I'm Donald Rumsfeld or something like that.
No, you answered Bob's question. You think it's, well, there's the terror threat out of Iraq. It was zero under Saddam.
Well,
it certainly wasn't zero. I mean,
here's where I probably disagree with my friend Dr. Ledeen. We know, as Dr. Ledeen points out, Abu Musab Zarqawi is one of the two enemies we're fighting there. He represents al-Qaeda in Iraq. But this is not the first time we fought him. We fought him in Afghanistan, and when he fled Afghanistan, Saddam Hussein gave him refuge. And from Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, he carried out attacks against us and against others, against Lawrence Foley, a diplomat in Jordan, for example, who was assassinated. He also had free access to the Ansar al-Islam camp that was up in the northeastern part of Iraq, which was absolutely tied to al-Qaeda, and Saddam Hussein knew he was going back and forth. We also know that there was a Salman Pak camp in just south of Baghdad. This was a camp where terrorists from around the world were being trained. And you can say, yeah, but I bet they weren't going to hurt us at any point. No, they were. Also, do we really think, if Saddam Hussein had had his druthers in the early 90s, he would have emerged as an emperor of the Middle East, oil-rich and nuclear-armed. I don't think, I disagree with Pat, that we could just wait that out for 20 or 30 years and it wouldn't do us any harm if that were to happen, or that would do us no harm if we let this caliphate, oil-rich and nuclear-armed, rise up somehow in the Middle East. Bin Laden, keep in mind, bin Laden's singular contribution to Islamism, which goes back to the early part of the 20th century, was to say, we don't need to just overturn Saudi Arabia and Egypt and these little regimes here. Let's go for the big one. Let's go for the United States directly, and when we knock them down, everything else will come our way.
For heaven's sakes, bin Laden's going to knock down the United States of America. You got a guy in a cave in Afghanistan who's going to knock down the United States.
That was the view of the Clinton administration during the 90s.
Well, let me look. They can knock down a couple of buildings, but look, any time if you get your Iraqi, suppose Saddam Hussein kept Kuwait and he has his oil empire, the last thing he wants is a war with the United States of America. The last thing.
That's what a lot of people thought in the 1930s about Hitler. Give him what he wants, a little elbow room, and he'll be satisfied.
I was in Baghdad in 1979, and I had a long interview. Well, it was a one-way interview because I didn't get to say much with Tariq Aziz, and believe me, Tariq Aziz was not a free agent. You may not know that, but he only said what he was supposed to say.
Yeah, sure, you're right.
And what he said was that at that time the U.S.-Iraq relations were getting warmer and warmer, and he said it is the Iraqi mission to get rid of these corrupt sheikdoms on the Gulf. Kuwait was the most vulgar of all these states, and that also that the mullahs in Iran were a threat to the peace of the Middle East, and we have to get rid of them too. They were fascistic or communistic, whatever you want to call them, dictators in Iraq, but they weren't anti-American. And I would say there's a lot more anti-Americanism in Iraq now than there was under the Saddam dictatorship.
In Iraq now? Look, as I say, I've worked with I've worked with Arab and Muslim, and particularly Iraqi, I would call them freedom fighters, for about 3 years. And I must say I was concerned that those I had been working with were not a representative sample. But when I saw 8 million Iraqis say to the terrorists, you can say you're going to kill me for voting, but I don't care. I'm going to dip my finger in this ink, and you'll know I voted. Come and get me. I have to say, I thought, you know what? This can work. Now, it's not that these people aren't being attacked every day for being friendly with America, for being collaborations for being America, for being infidels, because they want to select their own leaders and they want to make their own laws. They are under constant attack from the former rulers of the country, the Party of Return, the Baathists, and from Al-Qaeda, led by Zarqawi. But they are our allies, and if they prevail, it'll have tremendous impact over this century.
Michael, you said that you thought we should have liberated Iran first. Are you advocating an invasion of Iran?
Do I have to say it again? I'll say it again. I'm against the use of military power against Iran. It would be counterproductive and stupid. What I want us to do in Iran is the same thing we did for other tyrannical countries where the people clearly wanted to be free and deserved political support from us. That's what I want to do in Iran. That's what the Iranian people are begging for. It doesn't require a single bomb or a single bullet. All it takes is a modest amount of money, a bit of broadcasting, and a few cell phones, and you'll have it.
And you don't think Bush is doing this?
Well, he's not doing it. It's not what I think. He's not. He's giving speeches saying, if the Iranian people show that, they want to be free, we will stand with them. Well, they show it every day. I mean, they had a whole week of violent demonstrations around the Abadan oil refineries and all through Khuzestan. We didn't do anything.
Covertly funding revolutionaries in
Open.
Iran?
What covert? Why? It doesn't have to be covert.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, Michael, let me ask a question. I agree with one point you made, which was, and it was similar to what the Stalin's Red Army did at Warsaw. They told the Home Army to rise up and then let the Nazis slaughter them. I don't think George Bush, one, knew that was what's going to happen when they told the Shias to rise up. But they lost about 50,000 people. You are not suggesting that we encourage the Iranian people to rise up against these mullahs and possibly face a similar massacre where we do not intervene, are you?
I don't think anything like that is likely to happen. But we're obliged to support people who want to be free. Pat, look, we just spent $100 million of U.S. government money in Kyrgyzstan, a place no one even can find on a map, even you, and you're great on maps.
Sure, Kyrgyzstan, sure.
Well, I couldn't find it on the map. I had to hunt for it. $100 million. Which taught the people of Kyrgyzstan how to organize successful nonviolent conflict against a regime, and they are headed for freedom. Mm-hmm. We haven't spent anything in Iran.
That's not what I heard.
We haven't done.
Go ahead.
We haven't done anything for the Iranians. We've done nothing, and we know how to do this. We're good at this. I mean, look at all the cases, from the Philippines to Georgia to Ukraine and so forth. I mean, all over the world. Iran is a country of enormous strategic importance to us. Mm-hmm. We have the overwhelming majority of the people. I mean, the numbers are on our side, on their side.
I just want to go back to Iraq for one thing. Do you agree with the senior people at the Pentagon who tell me that they feel that the presence of over 100,000 Western troops in Iraq is a tremendous propaganda instrument in favor of radical Islam, that it is a very, very difficult handicap for our friends in not only in Iraq but throughout the Middle East?
No, it all depends if we win or lose, whether it's a handicap or a blessing for our friends. If we win, it's a great blessing for our friends. If we lose, it's a disaster for our friends, just like always. It's not an abstract thing in itself. I think the Iraqi people, I think the best judge of this are the Iraqis themselves. And you look at the polling of Iraqis, it's been very consistent. Do you want coalition forces in your country? Do you want them out as soon as possible? Yes. Do you want them to leave right away, or do you want them to stay and train and provide for your own? They want that. They want to. They hate occupation. They want the troops gone. We want to get out of there. I mean, we have from the beginning. We've never spoken of occupation, but it has to succeed, because if it fails, it's hell to pay.
I think they want us out now, and I believe that it is seen throughout the Middle East as equivalent of the Crusaders, of a foreign Christian or Judeo-Christian element in their region, and they hate it.
It's not seen that way, obviously, in Lebanon, where the site of the Purple Revolution has inspired the Cedar Revolution. It's not seen that way in Egypt, which is having the first demonstrations that they've ever had, and Mubarak is promising more open elections. And there have been demonstrations throughout the Muslim world. Even someone like Yosef...
Given all, I mean, we've all seen these surveys that show Bush at 4% or 5%, Morocco and all these places, and bin Laden. It seems to me that if you had a vote of the masses of the Arab peoples, one man, one vote, secret ballot, would they not vote to say to the United States, get the hell out of our region and let's throw Israel into the sea?
No, I don't think so. As long as you let them, as long as everybody votes.
Well, that's what I said.
I mean,
everybody a secret vote?
Your line about Saudi Arabia, where you thought that if the Saudis got to vote, they would put in some kind of Islamist regime.
We just heard from Arno, who said, in a fair election, getting rid of the regime, Osama wins it.
Well, that's what he says, but I don't believe that Saudi women are going to vote for the burqa. I mean, I've never understood this theory.
And Saudi Shia.
Do they really think that all those women in Saudi Arabia, they don't want to drive their own cars, they want to be covered from head to foot all the time? They watch television all the time. Well, right, they don't. And they're not going to vote for it. And it's not going to happen. And this is just more on the lines of whatever the United States does in that part of the world is wrong because. People want to be free.
By the way, the
Saudi people want to be free along with everybody else.
Elections in Saudi, women probably will vote, and Shia voted in the most recent ones. These elections were sort of proto-elections, but they're better than anything we've ever seen before in a state that has spent more to promote Wahhabism, which is profoundly anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Christian, than the Soviets ever spent to promote communism in dollar figures. Wahhabism is the soil from which Islamism grows, and we shake their hand and give them our money and make believe we don't know what they've been doing all this time.
Yeah, but you think they actually believe in Wahhabism. They believe that.
Some of them do, and others do not.
And some of them, if they're free, they will vote according to the principles of Wahhabism?
You know, look, there's no question there is a danger to democracy that you don't know how people will vote. But democracy properly understood. Well, but then we go back to our old philosophy of supporting the tyrants, because and saying to the people of the Arab and Muslim worlds, you've got a choice. The choice is between these tyrants who stultify your society or the radical Islamists, because we do not believe that you deserve or can handle the kind of freedom and human rights and democracy that we have, and we don't want it for you. That's been our policy for the past 50 years. Go ahead and say we should do more of it if you think it's brought us good things.
Well, Michael, let me ask you, you're talking about the collapse of the Soviet Empire. When the Soviet Empire collapsed in Poland, they were facing off against Lech Walesa and Solidarity and Pope John Paul II, and you had a renaissance of freedom in that country. At the same time, when the Soviet Empire collapsed in Afghanistan, they were facing the Mujahideen, and what you got was the Taliban. Why did Afghanistan in 1989 not go the way of Poland? What explains that?
Well, okay, one of the reasons is because Pat says he's against intervene in Afghanistan afterwards. We said, okay, the Soviet Union has collapsed.
But we didn't intervene in Poland. We didn't send troops into Poland.
We didn't have to. That's absolutely true. We allowed bin Laden and we allowed the Islamists to simply take over, not through democratic means in Afghanistan.
Would you have sent troops into Afghanistan after the Soviets left?
You know, it's very hard for me to say what I would have done. I would have had a presence there in one way or another to stop Osama. I would have stopped Osama bin Laden from setting up terrorist training camps and operating there with impunity for the next 10 years.
But explain to me, why did Afghanistan go a different direction in Poland, and how does that play into your theory of democratization of that part of the world?
Because we abandoned Afghanistan and we supported Poland. That's why.
It has nothing to do with it. There are differences in culture between Poland and Afghanistan.
And there are huge differences in culture.
But they don't have political ramifications?
Of course they have political ramifications, well, because some people, some societies will take a generation or two before they evolve into working democracies. I mean, I remind you that the United States fought one of the bloodiest wars in history after quite a long period of being an independent democracy. There's lots of cases of thoroughly civilized cultured societies that have elected dictators that are freely opted for tyranny. I mean, these things happen.
New England town meetings are going to look. I mean,
No one's saying that. No one's arguing
But
that.
nobody thought that Berlin was going to elect
look,
Nazis
even in
either,
Iraq,
but they
even
did.
in Iraq, the Kurds went out and voted over 100% for an independent Kurdistan. I understand that. And the Shias went out and voted the way the Ayatollah told them to vote. I mean, the idea that you're dealing with some sort of Western democracy here, and the Sunnis stayed home because they were told to stay home, and they're told they'd be killed if they went to the polls.
Everybody was told they were
The idea
gonna
that
be
this is
killed.
going to be some working democracy, look, it has never existed in that part of the world. And it seems to me that in that case, there's liable to be something in the soil or in the culture or in the history or in the tradition that is different than in the Western Christian tradition that you had in Central Europe.
It's the DNA, like I said
not
before.
DNA,
Yeah,
it's
they're
history
missing
and
a
culture.
chromosome. They're missing a chromosome. Give them a chance. I mean, they're doing incredibly well.
Look, if it fails, we can go back to supporting tyrants, I suppose.
We're
but
almost
one
at
has
time.
What was I supporting now?
What?
You've been supporting
I've been
tyrants.
supporting tyrants?
The U.S. government has been supporting tyrants in the Middle East for 50 years. Of course we have.
Look, we're in with due respect, this is one thing that Bush said that bothers me. He says our policy in the Middle East for the last 60 years has been a failure. That is nonsense. The United States worked with a lot of Arab leaders and dictators and shahs and Pinochet and South Korean generals and the rest of them, and the result of this pragmatic, tough, consistent policy of containment was that all of Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Empire collapsed. That's the real world. The idea that you're going to have to create something.
Pat, let me just say, Pat is right on that, but now that the Soviet Empire has collapsed, let's look at the threat that exists right now to us, those who are saying they want to kill us, and they want to kill us even if we're willing to throw them a few bones or a few other little
The problem with this neo-Wilsonianism is where does it end? Do you say, well, okay, let's really use all the powers of subversion we have to get rid of Putin? I mean,
No. But we had Condi Rice just now in Russia, and what she was saying was, and I give her great credit, is we're really very disappointed with what's going on here. There is all kinds of different ways
that broke his heart,
to provide
but,
pressure. Look, we have had the Rose Revolution in Georgia. We've had the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. We're having the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon right now. We're having protests in Egypt, in Bahrain, and across the... And none of this means anything?
If we support Putin. I hate to tell you that, but did we give him a free pass in Chechnya? I mean, the idea of a doctrinaire support of a theoretical democracy around the world is absolutely impractical.
It's not doctrine.
Don't you think we should be supporting free press in Russia that Putin has suppressed? I certainly do.
Well, that's one of my least worries, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of other problems.
They just said there was a free press, didn't you, that we ought to shut down Hezbollah's free press?
No, it's Pat. It's not
You
a
said
free.
we ought to shut it down.
Pat, it's
if
not
it gets out of hand, take
Pat,
care of it.
Pat, if you think a free press is somebody getting on and calling for people to volunteer as suicide bombers to kill America, I think your interpretation
my
of the
guess
First
is-
Amendment and mine are rather different.
Maybe we
I
could
think
agree on
Hamas-
shutting down. Maybe
you
we
give
could agree on
Hamas a
shutting down the
newspaper,
BBC.
That's what they'll call for.
What?
Maybe we can agree on shutting down the BBC.
Let me close it out with one last question, which we can go from my right to left and answer. Should the United States of America ever go to war when a vital national security interest is not threatened?
There can be, look, I believe in the Monroe Doctrine. For example, if there were massacres taking place, say, in the Caribbean or something like that, it was a genuine horror, and we had the ability, and it was in our sphere of influence, I might well favor intervention. But I do not believe you can send American boys who have committed to defend this country into war to give their lives unless America's vital interests or national honor are at risk. And I would fold up all these alliances dating to the Cold War. I would bring the troops home from all over the world, and I think we could be secure in our own country.
I don't think we should ever send troops out when vital American national interest is not at stake. Now, that is a subjective judgment. Was a vital American interest at stake in Kosovo? I don't believe it was, but some people would say it was. But I believe that still has to be the measurement, and measurement is taken by the governing power in the United States. The other thing that we have to say about this situation is that the effects of the democratic system in the United States as a restraint on going to war are minimized because we have, for the first time in the history of the country, a professional army. It is a better army, I believe, than the army I served in during the Korean War, which was a conscript army. It is a very competent army, but it is a professional army, and so that there are, particularly in the elitist class, some of the people, I might say, who are the greatest advocates of a forward military policy, have nobody in their family who serves abroad, who have no contact, there's no danger of their sons and daughters going into the service. So I believe that is another dangerous situation, that we have this volunteer army that is an instrument of foreign policy, where a conscript army has the restraints of a democratic system in this country upon it.
Well, I can only say that I suggest you not try, please, that you not try this argument out on U.S. Marine Lieutenant Gabriel Ledeen, or on Simone Ledeen, who's in Afghanistan. I mean, and if you would take the time to look at American officers who are currently involved in this war, you will be astonished at the number of children of the American elite. I mean, people
How about enlisted men?
People that you wouldn't believe, enlisted men too. I mean, lots and lots of them. I mean, the stereotype of the American military today as a force composed of people from the underclass who are desperate for work and can't do anything else, and so they go into the armed forces. That's nonsense. The kids in our armed forces today come from the best families. They come from the best universities. I mean, I was flabbergasted as Gabriel went through the sort of various training procedures. But anyway, the basic question is, would you send would you send your own children to fight if American national interests weren't at stake? And the answer is obviously not. Nobody would. No responsible person would. But national interest is, as Pat said, not so easy to define sometimes. And historically, unfortunately, it has often proven to be the case that when you had the opportunity to intervene early at a relatively lower cost, and you didn't, and you let time pass, got bigger and worser, and the cost was enormously greater later on. I do not believe that there is any escape from the war we're involved in now. And I will quickly add, I forget whether it was Bob or Pat who said this, but I agree with it. I mean, this threat, the terrorist threat that we're facing now, is peanuts compared to the China that we're probably going to have to deal with down the road. And I'm alarmed that so much energy is going into thinking about debate over Iraq this and Iraq that, and almost nothing is being spent talking about China, which is a country bent on our destruction, and says so publicly, and it's 1.5 billion people, and they're obtaining military technology and all these various other things. But historically, and again, I'm an historian, when you get in a fundamental conflict, a fundamental ideological conflict, which is what we're in right now with these people, you can win it or lose it, but you can't get out of it. And the longer we wait, the more costly it's going to be. Thanks.
I'll try to be brief here and just say, look, for a long time we were very lucky. We had a friendly nation to our north and a weak nation to our south and two oceans to our east and west. And we had a sort of glorious isolation. But I think 9/11 has to bring home that the world is a small place, and we cannot protect ourselves from those who are our sworn enemies unless we fight them, and unless we understand what they're up to and what they want from us, and that it's not a little change here and a little appeasement there. I think if a few years ago we had been having this same argument about Afghanistan, I have to assume that my friends Pat and Bob would say there's nothing that Osama bin Laden is doing in Afghanistan that warrants us going in there and sending young American boys to close down his terrorist training camps and stop him just because he's blowing up a few statues of Buddhas and making women wear burqas and cutting off the arms and legs of infidels. But that was a rising threat that we didn't face. Our national interest is to stop those
who have sworn a holy war to destroy our civilization. And I think we're doing it. The front of the war right now is Iraq. Osama bin Laden knows that. Zarqawi knows that, and they say it. If we defeat them there, the consequences will be enormous. And if we lose there, the ramifications also will be terrible and tragic.
I want to thank our excellent panel, Cliff May, Michael Ledeen, Bob Novak, Pat Buchanan.
Also, let's all thank Terry for the great job he's done today for us.
And Dave
Terry
for putting
Jeffrey.
this conference together.
And thank all of you for coming and really making this a terrific success. I want to thank also our C-SPAN audience for joining us as well. Hope everyone will join us again in the fall, where we will be having another conference, possibly on the border. I have to clear that with the chairman first. But now we have a reception, and let me also thank the great panel that we had today. It was just a great debate. Really appreciate you all joining us. We have a reception now down the hall, right before the restrooms. I apologize for the reference, but that's something I can tell you. Right before the restrooms, on your left is the room where the reception is going to be held right now. Thank you all again. It's great to be with you once again.
My pleasure. Thank you.